In addition to the trade war on the ground, there is also an open and covert struggle in space, which is satellite internet. Why? Because the capacity of the low Earth orbit is limited. Although according to the Outer Space Treaty, it is a public resource, but there is also a first-come, first-served rule. You have to grab a good position. So at present, the world is actually mainly dominated by China and the United States in this space competition. Let's take a brief look. I don't know if you have noticed that in the past 2 years, Xinhua News Agency has often reported a type of news, that is, China has issued another communication technology experimental satellite was launched on May 13th. The 19th satellite was just launched into space. So what is it for? In short, it is used to test satellite communication technology. The communication for high-orbit satellites is actually quite mature. However, for low-orbit satellites, there are still a lot of technologies that need to be tackled. Why? Because this low-orbit satellite is closer to the Earth, about 300 to 2,000 kilometers away. But it is responsible for an unprecedented communication architecture, that is, satellite internet. The original Autonovi satellite mainly served some professional fields, such as maritime, national defense, rescue, etc. Of course, ordinary users can also use this satellite phone, but the penetration rate is very low, and its transmission bit rate is also very low. So it is mainly through voice, sending text messages, etc. Low-orbit satellites not only face hundreds of millions of ordinary users, but also have to bear the transmission of high bitrate data to be able to access the internet. This is equivalent to satellite broadband services, so to some extent, there is a competitive relationship with ground optical fiber. So in this regard, everyone is familiar with SpaceX's Starlink. This Starlink is planned to have 40 to 1,000 satellites. So as of now, nearly 9,000 have been launched. This is the world's largest low-orbit satellite constellation. And then there is also Cooper. So more than 3,000 are planned. The old service provider Telsat is planning about 300, and this one, the OneWeb, has planned about 700 satellites. Among them, Starlink is undoubtedly the absolute main force. In China, since 2020, WeChat Internet has risen to the strategic level, which has spawned many constellation plans such as G60, State Grid Honghu 3, Hongyan Tianqi, etc. Among them, G60 is also called Qianfeng constellation. It and State Grid are both national projects. The scale is directly comparable to Starlink. From the perspective of the planned number, the total is currently more than 28,000. If Honghu 3 is included, it is a constellation in which Blue Sky Aerospace has a stake. Then it is planned to launch 10,000 satellites. In fact, it is only a paper estimate that it has exceeded 88,000 satellites. And this is still based on the filing application to the Telecommunications Department. It is a rough calculation. If combined with their internal business planning, it is calculated again. If we look at some of the large and small constellation plans around the world, then in fact, it is very likely that there are already more than 100,000 satellites. In other words, if these low-orbit constellations around the world are fully developed according to their respective development goals, then in the next 10 to 20 years, there will be more than 100,000 satellites to be launched into the sky. The question is this enough? The answer is not absolute. If we look at it from a theoretical perspective, then in an absolutely ideal situation, that is, with perfect collision avoidance, debris management, and spectrum coordination, it is completely sufficient. According to the existing space model, the upper limit is approximately between 1 million and 10 million satellites. The specific number depends on the distance between the satellites. Now there are only 100,000 satellites, so this place is quite rich. But the problem is that this matter may be more complicated than we imagined. With the number of satellites is increasing. In order to avoid collisions, the spacing will be increased for safety reasons. Because once there is a collision, according to the Kessler effect, the entire orbit may be unusable. Therefore, within the range of 300 to 2,000 kilometers, the density of a single shell is actually much lower than the upper limit. This value is generally 0.01 grams per square kilometer in academic research. In fact, there may be a few more zeros in the middle. So the actual feasible capacity is usually reduced to 100,000 to 1 million grams. If there are multiple collisions in the next 5, 10 or even 20 years, the total capacity will be further reduced. Of course, this is a paper discussion. In actual deployment, whether it is the country that launches the satellite or the ITU, they will definitely make full predictions. Well, we can improve the density as much as possible through technological upgrades. But overall, the number of satellites that can actually be accommodated in the low Earth orbit is still full of uncertainty. If you don't occupy a place first, you may be passive later. And the most realistic point is that 300 to 2,000 kilometers are all low Earth orbits, but it has a central position among them. So the middle section is more popular. From the current launch, 500 to 600 kilometers and 1,100 to 1,200 kilometers are more popular. The reason is that if it is positioned in the 500 to 600 kilometers orbit, it can obtain very low latency. The actual measurement is about 25 milliseconds, so this is suitable for building satellite broadband and can transmit streaming media. And this altitude also saves rocket propellant, which is suitable for large-scale deployment. Currently, Starlink, G60, and Cooper primarily concentrate on these altitudes. A common question arises. Why not go lower for even greater propellant savings? While lower altitudes might seem more efficient, they compromise constellation coverage due to higher atmospheric density, increasing orbit maintenance costs and accelerating orbital decay, which shortens satellite lifespan. Early experimental satellites often launched at lower altitudes, but commercial operations ultimately favor the 500 to 600 kilometers range. The 1,100 to 1,200 kilometers altitude, with the latency measured at around 40 milliseconds, still supports internet services while offering broader coverage, fewer satellites needed for global reach, longer satellite lifespan, lower atmospheric drag, and lower collision risks, less congestion. Practical altitude selection thus balances multiple factors. Beyond these prime bands, other altitudes see limited use. To low reduces operational lifespan, to high increases latency. The 600 to 1,000 kilometers range is awkwardly positioned, lacking the advantages of either extreme. The 500 to 600 kilometers band is particularly critical for satellite broadband, a key component of 6G technology, where latency and signal quality are paramount. However, this zone, especially the 550 kilometers altitude at 53 degrees inclination, is already 50 to 70% saturated by Starlink, making it vital for competitors to accelerate launches and avoid complete dominance. Satellite internet requires not just prime orbital real estate, but also mastery of a groundbreaking communication architecture, fraught with technical challenges. This explains China's frequent launches of communication technology test satellites. Beyond securing orbital slots, they aim to preemptively claim spectrum resources, which depend on efficient utilization. In communications, the ITU categorizes spectrum by wavelength into decimeter, centimeter, and millimeter waves. Satellite communications commonly use LS decimeter, C, Q, centimeter, and K, millimeter bands. C-band spectrum is already highly congested. Q-band is moderately strained with hotspots nearing saturation, while Ka-band remains relatively underused but is being rapidly depleted by LEO deployments. Over the next 5 to 10 years, Ka-band will be a key battleground, though higher frequencies like Q/V bands are also being explored. Starlink has already begun deploying the and E bands, reflecting a trend toward higher frequencies for greater bandwidth, though these face increased atmospheric attenuation. Shorter wavelengths reduce diffraction, while rain and dust absorb signals, requiring advanced antenna technologies and communication algorithms. LEO's 500 km altitude balances path loss to high, and altitude exacerbates signal degradation with coverage limitations. Lower altitudes require more satellites. Intersatellite communication for large constellations relies on laser links, posing challenges in precision pointing, power consumption, and data algorithms. LEO constellations represent the most technically demanding communication project in history, involving tens of thousands of space-based base stations moving at 8 km per second, real-time routing calculations, and managing hundreds of intersatellite topology changes per second. Success would not only dominate 6G technology, enabling SIM-free satellite internet on mobile devices, but could also unlock secondary applications such as Starlink's mysterious Starshield project, worth exploring in future analyzers. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.